What's going on, guys? The time is finally upon us to dive into this very significant paintbrush of sorts, if you will, for the art of bonsai. And that is this idea of wiring, and not just wiring now. We're talking about wiring in terms of secondary, tertiary. How do we make a branch? How do we make 2 branches? How do we make 3 branches? How does the wiring strategy work based on what we've done with our structural wire to position those bigger pieces of the framework? How do we organize? How do we utilize? How do we wire branches in tandem? Where does our thought process come from? How do we finish the tips? How do we design that branch? What are the different options for design to complement that tree and bring out all of its characteristics? This is secondary and tertiary wiring, and when we look at a bonsai tree, this singular technique of how we go about this entire thought process, this technical approach, and the execution of the wiring process as it pertains to not just wiring, but also styling the branches, laying them out in pad formation throughout the tree, is what gives viewers the biggest interpretation of what we're trying to convey as the creator of that piece. This is super exciting to get to dive into. I promise you nobody's broken it down like this before. And before I really dive into the Mirai style of how we do this, I just want to bring up that idea that every single professional and practitioner is going to have a different methodology that they take to this technique and they take to this approach. It's your guys' job as the viewer to pick out that person or that professional or that practitioner's approach that speaks to you and that you find aesthetically appealing and that you have success with, okay? Now, we've worked really hard at Mirai to try and break this down to be as objective as a process as possible. What are we trying to accomplish? Always our major question that we ask ourselves when we dive into any action or approach to bonsai. And so I hope that this sheds some light, gives you guys some fundamental backbone to function on, and also delivers the aesthetics that you need to be able to make a beautiful branch for any bonsai tree that you approach, okay? Getting into this now, we always have to consider 2 things, and I'm going to do a review because now we're talking, we did structural wiring. Structural wiring is its own world. Structural wiring is how do we manipulate the shape of the trunk? How do we set the position of the primary branches that originate from the trunk? If you haven't seen that video, please watch that video. It will set up the backbone for you to understand what we're doing here, okay? In that process of wiring, function and aesthetics, always our 2 considerations. So when we come back to secondary, tertiary, our 2 considerations do not change. We've got to be thinking about, does the wire work? And when it's working, does it look good? Okay? Now we're starting to give a very significant aesthetic push towards the design of the tree with our secondary and tertiary wiring. Our structural wire and our structural choices place those branches where they are and are very visible because of their size and their gauge of that wire. Now, our secondary, tertiary wiring is very significant in terms of the execution of technique because we create the positive masses throughout the design space that isolates and directs the viewer's attention. So we're thinking about, does it work and does it look good? Now, we also had those 3 rules. As much as we say at Mirai, we don't do rules. There are 3 rules that we do adhere to in wiring, whether it's structural, whether it's secondary or tertiary, to be able to maximize the function and aesthetics. And we're saying the same angle on every single turn of wire, and we're saying that angle is 55 to 60 degree angles. We're elongating that commonly accepted 45-degree angle, less wire, more functional, okay? Same spacing between each of those turns of our wire. And if you haven't seen this, again, refer to the structural wiring video. We outline this in its most simple, clear, concise form. Last, no gaps between the wire and the branch. 1, those negative spaces, if we have gaps, are very distracting to the eye. Number 2, those negative spaces allow that branch to move within that wire and we lose function or holding capacity of that wire. That does not change. Same angle, same spacing, no gaps, does not change in structural, does not change in secondary, tertiary. It is a universal set of rules that apply across the board to applying wire to a bonsai tree. However, inside of the secondary, tertiary wiring model, we have 1 more piece that we're going to add. And typically, with our structural wire, we don't usually encounter 3 wires in any one location if we're using the appropriate gauge to maximize the bend. But when we get into our secondary, tertiary, where we're going to have a lot more branches in a lot closer proximity, we want to avoid having any more than 3 wires in any single location. Okay? This is why you guys are watching this. How do I do that? That's so tough. Oh my gosh. What is the theory, the strategy, and the application technique to be able to avoid that and still have function? This is why we're here today. Okay? Now coming back to the review of our structural wire, because I want to go ahead and draw this line. I want to review what we learned, and then I want to erase structural wiring and really focus on secondary, tertiary. They are 2 different universes, and we've got to separate the technique, the approach, everything in terms of where we stand, how we approach that, and what we're thinking when we're doing it. Structural wire. Trunk and primary branching is what we're using when we're considering structural wire as the approach. Okay, we're putting big, thick gauges to manipulate the trunk shape and set those shoulders and those positions of our primary branches that originate from the trunk. We're saying the function in structural wire is derived from the contact with the shoulder of the branch. Okay, right where that branch is, and we talked about if you lower, we hit from the top. If you raise, we hit from the bottom. There are exceptions to that. These are the general concepts that apply to or functionally, structurally wiring, okay? In addition to that, and this is one of the big ones, a big nuance between structural and secondary, tertiary, our body position when we're wiring structural branches, we're standing to the side of the branch so that we have the push-pull of the leverage on that thick wire, okay? Now, I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna say, all right, structural, here we go. When we dive into secondary, tertiary, now instead of talking about the trunk and the primary branching, we're going to be using smaller gauges of the wire, and we're going to be dealing with secondary, tertiary, which basically organize into our pad design or our positive space in the creation of our bonsai, okay? And inside of this, our function is derived from the support of the structural wire. So we talk about structural wire application. Now that structural wire sets the backbone for our secondary, tertiary wiring and pad formation, development, styling, etc. Okay? In addition to, and we cannot ignore or avoid the fact that the shoulder or the collar, where those branches attach to that primary piece coming off of the trunk, where our secondaries and tertiaries attach, we still have to enter that shoulder. We don't lose the necessity to enter that shoulder. But in addition to, we've got this big backbone that gives reinforcement and function to our wire. Our body position, when we start secondary, tertiary wiring, where we were from the side in structural, we now turn and the branch faces us as we're doing secondary, tertiary wiring. So we're always having the trunk and the branch facing us. This gives us an ability to orient. We no longer need the leverage that we needed to apply with the thicker wire, and we see that combination and all of those mechanics coming towards us to be able to style that pad out in a very effective and efficient way and wire it with aesthetics and function in mind, okay? So now seeing those 2 differences, function derived from that structural wire, body position is going to shift. We're going to do away with any considerations of structural wiring that are specific to it, and we're going to move solely into secondary, tertiary wiring as a bonsai practice. Okay, so before we can ever dive into the actual mechanics and the actual aesthetics of secondary, tertiary wiring, it absolutely holds true that the success of our secondary, tertiary wiring hinges immediately on how we clean, prepare, and prune that branch to be wired. One of Mr. Kimura's biggest secrets, and I say this all of the time, was not his ability to dramatically bend trees. It was his ability to prune. Now, this went from branch selection on the structural level to the preparation of each individual branch that he was creating, pruning, and preparing for his youngest apprentices to be wiring with success. When we dive into the wiring process, so many times we are so anxious to start applying the wire that we never actually do the preparatory work mandatory to give ourselves the opportunity for success. So let's dig in here first and clearly understand how this applies to pines, junipers, elongating species, and deciduous, okay? And it's a universal consideration at this point for preparing the structure and setting ourselves up for success. So we're talking about Pruning, cleaning, and preparation for secondary, tertiary wiring on a branch-by-branch basis. And we're saying, in general, as a generic broad overview, we're going to be going through and we're going to be eliminating the bottom growing pieces off of that branch. We're going to be eliminating immediately upward or vertical growing pieces off of that branch. We're going to be cleaning out growth out of the crotches that are clogging up and sort of congesting our branch. We're also going to be opening up or cleaning that first 1/8 to 1/4 inch of any of our finer ramification coming off of that piece that we'll be wiring to make room for our wire. We'll come in and we'll make decisions on weak or poorly ramified pieces of growth on the interior portion of the tree and throughout the length of that branch that we're going to be wiring. And we're going to be making sure that we set ourselves up for alternating branch structure so that we give ourselves the ability to achieve that shape, that fan shape or pad shape that we're looking for and that we value in bonsai. Now, a few things that we need to discuss in terms of this whole idea, because this isn't necessarily in terms of order of priority. These are just all of the considerations that we have to be approaching when we go into prepare a branch in its totality. Sometimes the alternating structure that we're trying to set up will be educated in terms of we're going to have a branch on the left and then the right and then the left and then the right. Well, maybe we had the opportunity to be starting with a branch on the right instead of the left, but maybe this one had a little bit more ramification or was a little bit stronger. Maybe this one was really long, leggy, and weak, and we said we're going to be removing some of those weak, and so we may see our alternating branching set up by some of these other decisions in the process, and we're going to be showing you this, okay? But we're looking to get rid of anything that is not going to contribute, anything that's too long and we have something to replace it, anything that allows us to establish a really fundamental backbone. Sometimes when we're talking about removing bottoms, maybe we want to reduce the length of that branch and that bottom growing piece gives us a very beautiful dropping transition. Sometimes maybe we need some density, maybe we need more ramification, and we don't have any lateral branching around a location where we have something originating from the top, and we need to maintain that. So there are exceptions to every single one of these pieces. Maybe the crotch growth is going to replace. Maybe we've got a very strong piece of crotch growth, and we've got a very weak leggy branch here that we'll actually go ahead and get rid of that branch and utilize the crotch growth to create that next piece of ramification in terms of that pad development. But understand, as we go through this and as we clean and prepare, all of these decisions hinge on establishing that structure and making that branch ready and prepared to be accepting secondary, tertiary wiring to execute the cleanest aesthetic and have the most function we can possibly achieve in the design of that branch. So we're going to start off sort of the pruning process with this raw juniper branch. And again, I want to focus on removing bottoms, removing tops, cleaning crotches, opening up that first 1/8 to 1/4 inch of the tertiary and secondary branches coming off of this. And then I want to come back and I want to establish my alternating branch distribution. And you can see that this is a fairly long whip that we're dealing with here. Now, inside of those theories, we can't just say that we establish a black and white of what we remove, okay? So I'm going to be sort of walking you through my reasoning. Obviously, I'm just going to open these up so that we have room for the wire. This is a really good way to practice your wiring skills by clamping a branch on here, okay? Now, as I'm coming out this branch, I'm just going to start by sort of orienting myself. I'm going to start by orienting myself to the branch by cleaning out that first 1/4 to 1/8 of an inch. And this is a really good way in the cleaning process to start to get a feel for what kind of branching and what kind of opportunities we have and just start to recognize the structure. Now, anytime that I have some of these smaller guys here, unless I don't have branching in that area, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get rid of those. Notice that I have this bottom piece here, but I also have a top piece here. When I start to look in this area as I'm cleaning out, I should automatically be thinking, which one of these is going to be in a better position based on the other branches that I have in the area? If I don't know, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to leave those, and I'm just going to kind of continue cleaning and getting a feel for what we're going to be trying to accomplish. Now, when we get to these thicker side branches that are more secondary. I would say these finer guys are more tertiary in size. I would say these thicker guys are more secondary, but if they're all originating from this primary structure, we consider them all secondaries. But as I get to these bigger pieces, I can go ahead and come out here and I can remove the bottoms off of this, knowing that I've got this beautiful lateral distribution of my finer pieces of ramification that in the future will form my tertiary components to build that density and that ramification on the branch. So I'm just going to clean out the bottom of this piece. Okay? Continuing to move out the branch, I'm just going to open up that first 1/8 to 1/4 inch so that I've got room for my wire to be able to get around these pieces of ramification. Notice that I'm coming to these areas where I've got pieces off the top and 2 laterals. This is where we're going to come back and do some of that alternating pruning selections to set ourselves up for those pads that we're going to be creating in that fan shape. Okay? And then as I get towards the tip, I start to notice, oh, I've got some very long pieces here. Now, obviously, when we're looking at this primary branch originating from the trunk line of our tree, we're going to be thinking about the length of this branch in terms of the totality of the tree that we're creating. For this wiring exercise, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say, I'm going to drop this back to these 2 lateral pieces as a good point of transition. I'm going to take off that length, and what we could hypothetically say is this is the length that I need for the length of the branch as it pertains to the tree that this primary piece is originating from. Okay, so I'm going to sort of set my lengths, and I'm always going to be pruning back to, if possible, laterally emerging as opposed to vertically emerging branches, just because it gives us a better transition. Okay, so now that I've got, let me go ahead and clean this off. Now that I've got that first 1/8 to 1/4 opened up, I'm going to start to work on that staggered branch pattern that we were talking about. And I'm going to start looking at it sort of from the tip working back. Now notice that I've got my 2 laterals here. Neither one of these are sort of originating from the same location, so I can save these guys. So I start to have my staggered pattern here. Now when I come back, I'm going to take my top off because I've got 2 laterals. If I have laterals in the place of where I have a top or a bottom, I'm going to go ahead and take that top or bottom off because I know I've got laterals to fill in that space. I've got here on the right side, I've got here on the left side, so then my staggered pattern is going to come back to the right. Okay, I'm going to take off that. Now, when we come back to this junction, I see I have another top and laterals. I can go ahead and take that top piece off there. I've got this staggered piece here, so I'm going to go ahead and alternate back to there. So now we're right, left, right, left, right, left. Notice that we start to get into a situation here where we have 2 of these. That's totally okay. Right? That's totally okay because we can use this as a branch to build body. We can use this as a branch to build our silhouette. And this is part of the styling process. But when we come back here, we see that we have this branch right on the bottom here, and we've got another one that's close in proximity on the top. I can now remove that bottom. Okay? As I move back into this area, now you see that leaving this branch off of the bottom fills this space over here that we don't have another branch to occupy that space. And if we were to use this, it's coming off of the top at a point where we have another lateral. I'm going to take that off. This is going to fill the right. This is going to fill the left. And now we've done a really beautiful, nice selection process of removing tops, bottoms, and staggering our pattern with those interior pieces cleaned out that first 1/8 to 1/4 to make room for our wire. We've made our length selections based on the proportion of the tree and how long we want this primary branch to be in terms of the shape of the tree. This is a really beautifully prepared branch to begin the wiring process. When we approach a deciduous branch, we've got to be a little bit more malleable than we do with a conifer because deciduous branches have a lot of odd turns and movement in the deciduous branch that gives a lot of quality. And instead of creating this really flat pad formation, we start to become a little bit more free with our pad creation. Okay? Now, we still have to clean off weaker bottom pieces, interior, inferior pieces, get rid of structural flaws. But we're going to be thinking a little bit more free with our formation to not try and create such a strict, disciplined pad. And when we look at deciduous trees, it's this out-up movement that gives us a lot of value. Okay? So here we have a pomegranate piece. I would have wanted to have done this prior to the leaves emerging. Again, we are where we are. So I'm going to go ahead and do this with leaves, but please know that this pruning process shouldn't be happening as a tree is leafing out, because this is now in an energy deficient state, having just produced these without them hardening off. Okay? First and foremost, I'm going to take away big solid nubs, and I'm going to leave just a little bit of tissue. If I take that farther back and I compromise sort of this flush cut to the perpendicular line, this branch emerging here. If I come back and I try to make a parallel cut and cut farther into that, this branch will tear right off when we go to wire. So I'm always just making a nice cut here, so I have boom, boom, a beautiful transition. And in fact, in deciduous trees, that angle right there is what gives movement to the ramification, whereas with a conifer, we would be probably doing that with wire. Even inside of conifers though, black pines and the angular movement of the branching is very attractive. So I'm just going to come back in here and I'm going to remove any dead branches, any of these nubs, and kind of get rid of some of that convolution. Okay? Now when I come back into some of these finer pieces of ramification, you will see where tips will have died back, where they didn't have the energy on a pomegranate. You obviously have thorns, maybe where flowers were produced. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take those pieces back. And you'll notice here, I've got a branch here, I've got an opposite thorn on this side. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take that off. Okay? Now when we start to look in here, we've got multiple options in terms of a deciduous tree. We have this big strong piece here, we move out, and then we've got this fork with ramification and a triad of branches. Now when I look at these have a lot more potential as more thin, finely ramified pieces than this thick coarse centerpiece, and we still, both of them have this sort of outward movement and not perpendicular to the branch. So I have a good crotch if I just come back in here and take that back, and a lot of times we'll want to cut back to 2 buds to set that up to be a really good branch. Where there was 1, we need to get 2. If I take this tip off, I've got 1 here and I've got an adventitious bud there. Now on this one, I've got 1 in my adventitious bud, so I wouldn't want to cut this one back any further. And in all actuality, having 1 be shorter and 1 be longer in terms of your branch staggering creates a more effective branch. Now on this one, we see that we've got this piece here and then this junction here where we've got 2 right there. I'll take out that strong center piece and go ahead and leave that. That's going to form really good ramification for the future. That looks very, very good. Okay. Now I see here at the base I've got this piece growing off the bottom. Unless I want to be replacing either of these 2, I'm going to go ahead and remove it, and I'm going to say that I don't want to be replacing either of these 2. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to save that, okay? Before I make any decisions on these big long guys, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to work out the rest of the pruning process, taking out this dead center tip. I've got ramification there and an interior piece. I've got these old thorns right here that don't have growth protruding from them. Okay, now when I get to this point, I see I have 1 growing off the top and I actually have 1 smaller piece off to the side here. I'm going to take off that vertical piece. Okay, now I've got this on the left, I've got another piece on the right here. I'm going to take off to create that staggering branch formation. Okay, now when I get to this tip, notice that I have 2 very thick coarse pieces originating. The central portion was cut here and I've got this beautiful elbow right here. In the future, I'm assuming I'll come back and probably take 1 of these 2 off. But for the time being, to get rid of this group of 3 and to give the tree the ability to dictate its own future, I'm going to take off the most unsightly one, which for this branch was the one growing dead vertical. If I just take this branch in the wiring process and lay it like that, this becomes a beautifully lateral branch and starts to create good ramification. Okay? I'm going to come back in here and I'm going to remove the remnants of that stump so that it's nice and flush. Okay, and then when I roll this over, I have some potential to use this, but it's still very much going to be on the bottom. If I have a choice between positioning this to be a lateral or positioning this to be a lateral, I'm going to take this all day long. Occurs at a better junction, and this piece now becomes a bottom growing piece, so I'm going to take that off. Okay. Now when I move out here to the tip, I notice I have another stump here. Central portion was cut. Where there was 1, we got 2. I'm going to take that out. Moving out this branch, depending on whether I want this length or not, that's what's going to inform how I treat this. I'm going to say in a deciduous tree, unless I want elongation, thickening, etc., I'm always going to be wanting to prune back the coarser pieces and start building with finer pieces. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to prune out this big knob of growth here. And I'm going to cut back to this lateral piece. again, flush and perpendicular to where that branch is originating, so I leave enough tissue for that to have support and success. And then when I move out this piece here, notice that I have a junction of 2 here, and I have a junction of 2 plus some dead stuff out here. I'm going to prune these off just so that I sort of give myself the opportunity to see what's going to happen. Guessing, and almost 9 times out of 10, with all that conglomeration of growth, no matter how well you prune it, it's going to be very thick and coarse. My more effective pruning decision to start building and refining the tips and transitioning that taper from thick to thin to thinner to thinnest is going to hinge on pruning back to those interior pieces that are a little bit finer, okay? Now knowing where my length is there, I can start to make decisions on this branch. In order for this branch to fit into the ramification I'm going to form here, I'm going to be roughly at this length and level. Now the reason that I'm pruning here and not pruning back to these pieces is because by pruning here, all of these are going to be stimulated to grow. And as this branch develops, when we come back next year, we may be coming back once we get these pieces of ramification shooting and pruning back to those. But one of the misconceptions about deciduous trees is that we should make that prune now and start building those. The problem with that theory is if this length is what creates an established branch now, we create that established branch now and we work to refine it over the course of time. If we're to prune back all the time saying, well, we're going to build it out to this length, we'll never get this branch to contribute to this length, and we actually impair the building process. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to leave that. Now that I know this and I know this, I can start to make a more educated decision about this, okay? And what we see here is that we've got the opportunity to cut back to here or potentially use more of this length to be able to fill out this silhouette. I'm going to say that I want this silhouette to be out in this area here, which means I'm going to cut back to a fork right in there. Okay, and in doing so, I need to come back into all of these areas where I've got these pairs, and I've got to start staggering my branch formation to be able to give myself the opportunity. Anything coming straight off the top on a deciduous, I'm going to remove. Any of these thorns I'm going to remove. Any bottom growings I'm going to remove. And because this ended up being on the left side, I'm now going to stagger to leave that on the right. I'm going to take off this vertical and leave this. Take off the bottoms and leave that on the left. And now you see, boom, boom, right, left, okay? So that creates that beautiful branching position that we're looking for, all right? So if I'm gonna move this here to create space for this here, which is generally what I wanna be doing, I'm going to be rolling this so that I maintain orientation of the leaves here. If this is going to form my silhouette and this is going to form my silhouette, I now have the opportunity to build interior mass here. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut back so that I don't create too much length on that interior mass. It starts to form that foliar canopy there. We're going to get ramification building. But with all of these other considerations, that's a beautiful pruning job to create a wonderful deciduous branch. We're now ready to wire. Okay, so before we go into the strategy and theory of how we secondary, tertiary wire and pair branches, we first need to understand the structural wire's sort of influence on our decision-making process, right? And this is where, even when we're structurally wiring, we need to be considering the secondary, tertiary branching and the secondary, tertiary wiring patterns that are going to follow the application of structural wire, okay? Because we say that structural wire, it forms the background and sets up the support or the backbone to give function for our secondary and tertiary wiring process, okay? But in addition to that, when we start to apply that structural wire, we've got to be thinking, what branches and what combinations are we going to be pairing in our secondary, tertiary application in order to make sure that when we're applying that structural wire, that we're seating it or placing it in positions that allow us to accomplish the best technical and aesthetic pairing of those branches that we know have the best idea of being put together. Now we're going to come back and we're going to talk about how we make those decisions and how we understand what branches should be paired. But we do need to highlight the fact that the structural wire giving us support also sets us up for success in terms of our secondary and tertiary branching combinations and pairing. And in order for that structural wire to serve as a backbone, we need at least 1.5 turns of that structural wire to be present in the location on one of the two branches we're going to be pairing. Otherwise, we don't have that backbone of support. So when we say structural wire is the backbone of support, and we're going to be transitioning from a 4, 6, or 8 gauge to a 10, 12, or 14 gauge, we need 1.5 turns of that thicker structural wire to allow us to be able to now link two branches of a smaller gauge of wire and have that structural support that we said that structural wire gives us. So I hope that that made sense in terms of how that structural wire influences our pairing, but now we need to go back a little bit and just say, how do we know which branches that we're wiring together when we start putting on this secondary and this tertiary wiring in this technical application, right? So this is a very, very simple decision-making process, and there are two main points that I tend to function with whenever I'm considering how do I start to choose my pairs to wire in tandem. First and foremost, we just have to establish the fact that we are, in secondary and tertiary wiring, we're wiring two branches together. We say that the structural wire gives function, and it does, it's the backbone. These smaller branches don't have nearly as strong of an attachment to that branch as the primary pieces coming off of the trunk. They're smaller, they're thinner, they're more flexible, and that big thick wire gives us that structural backbone and support. But inside of that, we're always pairing two branches together in the secondary tertiary wiring process because those two branches support each other, and it's a major aspect of function, okay? And when we pair those two pieces together, we're looking for branches that are of a similar size. Now, we say a similar size because we don't need exactly the same size. The more proficient, the more technically capable you guys get, the more of that size discrepancy you're going to be able to manage while still successfully wiring those branches together. Successfully meaning we're able to make it look good and the branches thrive and don't suffer from that pairing. So in the beginning though, and over the course, even now in my most advanced practice of wiring, my mind automatically, when I look at a branch, I'm looking at, all right, I got a similar size here and here, similar size here and here, similar size here and here, as set up by my pruning and cleaning process. Mind you, I prepared that situation for success. When I'm applying my structural wire, I'm saying, in order to pair these two, my wire must insert or hit this location to successfully pair those two. Now you start to see this sort of building process that is secondary tertiary wiring as facilitated by that structural wire. So we're looking for similar sized branches, and we're also looking for branches that are close-ish in proximity, because we're saying, listen, we don't want to be wiring branches that are directly across from each other. Number one, how do we effectively clean and prune that branch to prepare it for wiring? We would never have that situation in the first place. But if they're directly across from each other, we don't get the benefit of that structural wire giving us that backbone. However, we also said in order to achieve a functional and aesthetically pleasing result, we don't want more than 3 wires in any one location. And you're already going to have a structural wire as one of those 3 wires on that branch. If we keep those branches concise and close to each other in terms of our pairing process, we're able to achieve that function and aesthetics, right? Pairing those similarly sized branches, relatively close in proximity so we don't accumulate too much wire. And over the course of time, you will see how these two considerations give you the best possible result in terms of function and aesthetics. Okay, now that we've got all of the pruning and we've got our branching alternating patterns set up, it's time to apply our structural wire. Now, I'm going to be hooking to the clamp here, and I'm going to be applying my structural wire. But as I'm applying my structural wire, I need to be considering my branching combinations so that my structural wire sets me up to have the appropriate movement to put all of these branches to the outside of the bend as much as is possible, as well as allows me to link branches of a similar size that are close in proximity. Okay, so when I apply structural wire, as we discussed in the structural wiring video, I want to be utilizing a gauge of wire that allows me to bend the branch anywhere that I want it to move. And this is an important thing because so often we start to tell ourselves that we only need a very minimal amount of structural wire because we don't want to move the branch that much. That's an ineffective thought process. Let me go ahead and just get this guy anchored here. Okay, so in the structural wiring application, I'm already thinking about, okay, I've got branches of a similar size here. I probably am not going to be able to wire them together because of the way that my structural wire is approaching from the shoulder of the branch or where it was anchored. So I'll have to rethink how I'm going to combine those two, okay? Notice how I'm supporting and I'm getting that same angle, same spacing, no gaps. This is all fundamental, okay? And as I'm applying this, I'm also thinking, okay, how far am I going to be carrying this thicker wire out to the tip of the branch? Now on raw branches that have yet to be refined and we've yet to start pruning back to these interior pieces to be improving that transition of taper, oftentimes on a raw branch I'll carry this structural wire out to the point where I no longer need it. Now inside of this, there is an opportunity to talk about a pairing process, and I'm just going to draw your attention to one opportunity that exists inside of this branch. If, for example, the base of this branch were thicker and I needed a 6 gauge instead of an 8 gauge, I could stop this structural wire 1.5 turns across the bottom, because when we lower, we always raise that last piece of wire across the bottom to give me control of the tips. I could stop this wire right here and look to transition my next gauge of wire to this thicker piece that does have some relative comparability of thickness to the end of this branch. And when I start to look further at what I've got to be able to pair this branch to in terms of my other branches, I do recognize that this is very thick compared to all of these other pieces. I'm going to say that it actually behooves me to stop this wire sooner as opposed to carrying it out to the tips. But this thickness here is much closer in proximity to this thickness here, so I'm going to carry my structural wire out to a point where I have control by ending across the bottom, but I also carry it out to a point in terms of thickness that I get function. Now I can come back in, cut this, leaving that last turn across the bottom, so that I can now pair this branch here to the end of this tip here and have a very nice transition of similarly sized branches without accumulating a lot of wire on the end of this piece. This is how we start to measure and gauge sort of that concept of aesthetics and function. We have function to here. Had we carried it further and tried to wire this thicker piece out to here, we would start to beat down or defeat aesthetics by adding too much wire to this location when we're still going to have smaller branches to be adding wire to. Okay? So once I apply this structural wire, and when we talk about structural wiring, I'm going to go ahead and remove this. Now you guys know my theory for how I'm going to approach this. All of these things being considered as I apply this, I need to go ahead and give shape to the structure of my branch. When we apply a piece of wire, we shape the branch. Now we talked about, or will talk about, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to probably preemptively address this now. When I apply this structural wire, I'm setting myself up for these branches to be in the correct position based on the movement I put into this structural piece. If I put these pieces on the outside, naturally they're going to be inclined and given the priority to contribute to the shape of the silhouette and build an easier fan-shaped pad. So when I start to decide on my movement, I'm going to go ahead and try to place these pieces on the exterior portion of bends. I'm going to make my bend right there, and now I've set myself up. And watch this, I'm going to make another bend right there to set this piece up. Now my movement comes here and here. I can set this guy up even further, and then I can bring this tip back into here, and I'm already starting to see the creation of my fan-shaped pad. That's as far as I go in terms of structural setup, having considered my branching combinations, having considered how I'm going to transition from this thicker wire to the next phase of branch pairing, and I've now done what I need to do in the wiring of my bonsai. I would apply this structural wire to all of the branches on the tree before I come back and I do secondary, tertiary application. Here I have two very different branching considerations in terms of how I'm going to be setting these up for success. So I want to be cognizant of that when we start this wiring process, okay? Because I have a definitive fork here, I have a definitive fork here, but the way that these two branches have their secondary and tertiaries arranged, I'm going to need to be making a decision regarding one or the other. And actually, boy, I didn't see that this was a pair of three. I may, yeah, in fact, I have to. I have to make a decision here. This is a miss on my part. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take off one of these big pieces because I have this beautiful, smaller, more compact piece. I'm going to take off this guy because it's so much longer and so much leggier. Okay, now we really shift the way that we're talking about these. Notice that I have two branches that are very thick. Clean up that stub. Notice that I have two branches that are very thick here and of the same size. Notice that I have a very thick branch and a very thin branch here, okay? Watch how I handle this in terms of my application of the structural wire. So as I'm applying my structural wire to this thicker piece here, same angle, same spacing, no gaps. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to adjust my body position here to be able to adequately apply this. I need to make a decision. How do I carry this structural wire onto this fork to give it the highest chance of success? And this is a situation that a lot of us come to when we're wiring bonsai, okay? Now, if I carry this structural wire onto this, obviously I have wire scars that exist from this being wired in previous iterations of its design. But beyond that, if I carry the structural wire onto this, I put a tremendous amount of stress on the crotch of this branch right here because my thicker wire is going to be pulling this branch away from that crotch. And we know that crotch to be susceptible. A lot of times when I'm wiring, I will go ahead and cross over that, which now pulls those crotches together and protects that crotch. Now, I wouldn't necessarily do so if this were the thicker piece and it needed this 6 gauge. But in this situation where they're both very similar, I'm going to go ahead and consider that susceptible area when I'm applying this wire. Okay, now because these are both similar sized branches, it doesn't do me any good to carry this structural wire very far down this branch. I get a turn and a half. I stop on the bottom so that I have control of the tip. And I cut, knowing that I need to transition to an 8 gauge to have function on both of these branches. That's as far as my structural wire is going to go. Obviously, my structural wire giving me the capacity to move here. I'm going to support. And I'm going to drop my branch down. Now I'm in a good position to be appropriately wiring these two pieces. That's as far as my structural wire is going to go there. Now, as I apply my structural wire to this piece, and obviously some of my structural wire application in this exercise is impacted by the position of the clamp, but we're still going to be able to get the concept established in terms of what we're doing. Okay? I need to carry my structural wire much farther down this branch in order to give function. Now, when I look at this, I notice that I have a moderately sized branch here that is similar in size to this branch right here. What that tells me is that this thicker structural wire needs to make it all the way down into this junction of this branch in order to adequately pair these two pieces together. Now, there's an exception to this, so I'm going to carry this up and on to this region of the branch, and then I'm going to stop so that we can talk about what our other options are, okay? Now, at this point, if we say, my wiring skills are not such that this 6 gauge, I can carry it down here without damaging the branch, that's okay. We could pair this moderately sized branch to this piece right here, run this down to here, and then look to carry this branch to here. And I'm going to show you that with the illustration of a pipe cleaner, where we would say, now I have the option where my structural wire is currently to be able to pair here and to carry this down. And let me link onto that real quick so that I can show you where I'm thinking. And I could carry that all the way down into this section right here and transition into some finer branching at this location. What that would mean then is that this next wire would have to move from this piece following that direction of turn and could then be utilized to pair to this piece so that these two are paired. We've carried our structural wire a turn and a half past the next junction, and we could then start to Potentially look to pair this and this, and this, all having the support of our structural wire. This is an acceptable solution to the potential issue that we've been dealt. I'm going to handle this a little bit differently, showing you guys how to handle it if your wiring skills on a thicker wire are capable of bearing some of the force that's going to be dealt to the finer branches. And this is where handwork and where the positioning of your supporting hand becomes such a priority for the ability to be able to wire all of these unique situations in the creation of bonsai. Okay, I'm going to carry my structural wire down to a point where I have a turn and a half past that last junction, turn and a half past where I need this to be, so I need one more turn. Okay, now I can adjust my structure, setting this up on the outside of that bend, and I can combine my finer branches in this area supported by my thicker structural wire. I can combine these two branches and have much less wire application on the branch itself, okay? Multiple ways to approach this situation. One major solid way to approach this situation, this is the nuance of structural wire and how it sets us up for secondary, tertiary application. Now in this situation, I'm set up with an interesting situation because I have 1, 2, 3 branches that are of a similar size. What this tells me when I approach this with a structural wire is that I need to carry my structural wire all the way to this branch or to this branch, and to a point where I'm able to transition amongst these branches in this region or transition amongst these branches in this region, okay? What that will set me up to do is be able to wire these two in combination or these two in combination, depending on how I carry that structural wire out to the branch. Now, one thing I also want to bring attention to is I'm consistently moving with a clockwise rotation. That has no significance on the strategy of wiring. It's just how the clamps were set up that gave me the strongest hold with relationship to the branches that existed. So please don't put any weight into the fact that I'm maintaining a consistent rotation on my structural wire. That is completely dictated in the wiring process by where the branch occurs on the tree. Okay, now notice as I'm applying this wire that I'm always approaching the branches from the bottom to support with my hand. This is functional structural wire at its best, always holding that contact so we maintain same angle, same spacing, and no gaps. So now we'll see again that similar situation where if I carry this structural wire out to here, I'll put a tremendous amount of force on that crotch. We know that crotch is susceptible. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to carry my structural wire out onto this piece to protect this crotch. I'm going to avoid that wire scar right there. And I said I've got to carry this out to a point where I have the support of the structural wire to be able to now start to work on my pairing in this region. Now this is an interesting situation. Clearly we're going to be wiring these two together. So in combining these two, I see that I've set myself up to be able to, with the current position of the structural wire, set myself up to be able to combine these two branches in tandem without any significant compromise to the quality of the structural wire. And so when I start to look at this area, I now need to think, how am I going to be combining these 3 branches in tandem to be able to effectively apply wire? Now I have a similar situation as I have here, right in this location here, where if I use this structural wire to protect this crotch, I can combine this branch to this branch, which means I need to carry my structural wire out to this location right here and get it to a point where I can then combine these 2 branches at the tip. This being a pine with a little bit thicker, coarser growth, I have the structural stability with the appropriate technique to carry my structural wire to that point, go ahead and cut it, and although I have only a half turn there, we have techniques that allow us to now combine these 2 branches, combine these 2 branches, and combine these sections to appropriately wire this piece. This is as far as we go with the structural wire on this pine. Now, when it comes to our elongating species branch, we had a very specific situation where we have these three pieces set up on the right side of the branch, and there wasn't any opportunity to create that staggered effect because we didn't have ramification in this area. This is, again, just another one of the many situations you guys are going to approach as you start wiring trees, because no tree gives you the perfect opportunity to apply the ideal wire. Okay? So as I'm applying my structural wire to this, I need to be thinking automatically about how I'm going to be positioning this wire to facilitate the different combinations, as well as how I'm going to be moving this branch to set those up for a beautiful aesthetic. Now right here we encounter one of the common situations that you'll all experience when you're wiring a branch, and that is this wire could go in front of this crotch or it could go behind this crotch. How do we make that determination? And this comes from setting ourselves up to look at our combinations of the branches we have in this region and making that decision based on how we plan to pair these branches. Now, these are branches of a differing size, but if we have appropriate technique, we can still effectively pair these by using the gauge that gives us function on this piece and very accurately and technically sound application on this smaller piece to avoid damaging, but to be able to pair these two and keep them in closer proximity. Knowing that that's my move, I'm just going to tighten this turn a little bit more. Notice how I just back that off. I'm going to come right into that shoulder and I'm going to keep on moving down the branch. Now that small adjustment does not compromise my same angle, same spacing, no gaps to a degree that it is very visually noticeable. That's what we're looking for when we're applying structural wire, to be making those decisions that give us the ability to pair our secondary tertiaries and have the most success we possibly can. Okay? Now notice, in doing so, I also set myself up to hit this point right here. Based on this decision, it placed my wire in the appropriate location to hit this point here, which means I can now combine this branch to this branch to this branch, and all of a sudden I'm out at the tip here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to carry this forward. Okay, now I'm at a point where I've got the potential to stop my wire here or carry it forward. If I'm not sure, when I wire this to this, this to this, and this to this, if I'm not sure how I'm going to move forward, I'm going to go ahead and extend my structural wire out the thickest point here, knowing that I have the skills with the support of my offhand to be wiring without damaging. I'm going to end it across the bottom here. I'm going to put that movement in to set this up, and I've set myself up here with these two pieces, here to here, here to here, to have all of the strategy in place. Okay, so I'm going to take, if I need to flare these, I'm going to go once away from that bend. Then I'm going to move into that bend to set this up on the exterior portion of that curve. I'm going to have one return here, and now I've got these three guys loaded up, one more curve there. All of a sudden, you see my branch pad form to create that fan shape. This is the magic. Now notice the movement that happens through this structure. Anywhere there's a bend, I'm setting up my exterior branches on the outside of that bend or that curve. This is effective and functional styling of a bonsai branch. Now on our deciduous branch, we're going to create some movement in this really straight section here. Already as I'm looking at this, I notice that I have this very big thick piece here and this thick piece here. Now obviously I could carry my thicker wire out to here, but I wouldn't have any structure set up along this thicker piece that would allow me to then wire this piece to this piece. Let me show you that potential first so that you understand where my mind is at as I'm approaching this tree. Okay, so if I'm coming onto this and I want to carry this wire onto this thick piece right here, what that would look like, let me come back to my pipe cleaner. What that would look like, say for example, I come behind this, okay, come over the top of this and come here. Okay, what this would look like if I took this strategy towards applying wire to this branch is now all of a sudden, excuse me, I'll end it right there. Now all of a sudden I don't have any structural wire here to be able to anchor these two pieces being wired in tandem. And that is not effective structural wiring, and that's not an effective setup for successful secondary, tertiary wiring. We always need this thicker wire to provide structure for all of the combinations that are going to be had. So when I look at this situation and I look at this combination of potential wiring issues that we're facing here, I see the opportunity with this thick piece to be applying a gauge of wire appropriate for this and managing its application on this thicker piece, still not the same size, but closer in proximity to any of the other pieces. I see that opportunity to combine these, and then potentially to either not wire this or combine it to this piece here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to carry my thicker wire all the way out to this section, so I have total control out to here. I now have the ability to combine these two and have success in the wiring process. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to alter that very straight section here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to tighten up my application there, obviously wiping out that very small bud, which we can get over. And then maybe even changing the direction here so that I now have the ability to combine all of my branches. This is where my structural wire ends. We've got 3 checkpoints, 3 things that you guys can reference. If you execute any 2 of these 3, you will be functionally and correctly wiring your secondary and tertiary branches together in tandem. Okay, so follow with me as we go over this. 3 checkpoints to properly pair your branches. Number 1, half of our wire in the combination is always going to follow the rotation of the structural wire. We would never go against the rotation of the structural wire. Structural wire is the backbone. It educates every single thing that we do. Half of our wire is going to follow that rotation. If our structural wire is spinning clockwise, we say the other half of the wire must spin opposite. So if half of it's spinning clockwise, the other half spins counterclockwise. And this opposite spin of direction creates tension on the wire and gives function to that tandem wiring of those 2 pieces of growth on that branch. Okay, so this is check number 1. Now inside of that, if we go back to and we start intermixing structural wire with secondary, tertiary, we would say, well, do I want my wire to be on the top or the bottom of the branch? Doesn't matter in secondary, tertiary wiring anymore. Our function is derived from the structural wire. So we're using that structural wire as that guide. Oh, the piece that's going to be following the structural wire to get down to this branch is rotating clockwise. Okay, I'm going to rotate clockwise. The piece that I'm wiring up here that isn't following the structural has to spin opposite of that direction. Oh, okay, I'm going to be spinning counterclockwise, clockwise, counterclockwise. Okay? Number 2, we're always entering the farthest point of the shoulder from our body. Now, this is a little bit complex to be able to explain and also to be able to understand. But if you're going to be effectively sitting down, analyzing a branch, and knowing that you're executing that wiring process correctly, you've got to be able to quantify your actions, all right? When we say our body position in secondary, tertiary wiring is placed in front of the branch, we have the trunk, we have the branch facing us, okay, and we're wiring towards us. We're always going to be entering the shoulder of the branch farthest away. And that shoulder, if you remember, is a 360-degree circumference. So if we take a look at this, here's our trunk, here's our primary branch, here we are, super excited to wire, and we've got these branches coming towards us. The shoulder that we're entering is, or the side of the shoulder that we're entering is always going to be the one farthest away from us, farthest away from us, farthest away from us, farthest away from us. The reason that we talk about this is because one of the biggest mistakes that you guys will make in wiring is you will follow concepts and rules that are not being provided by this methodology we're teaching you at Mirai. You'll try to keep the wires together. You'll try to follow the structural wire to a degree that it compromises your ability to effectively combine these 2 branches. And this side of the shoulder is where a lot of us will end up entering, and it will break down the entire system, okay? So we're saying we're following half of the structural opposite with the other. We're always entering the farthest side of the shoulder on any branch that we are wiring, knowing that we're sitting in front of the branch. Number 3, once we start wiring in a direction of rotation. Now again, any 2 of these 3 will mean you cannot screw up in your application of wire. You can't make a mistake if you execute 2 of these 3. So what we're saying here is, if we start in a clockwise direction as we're following that structural wire, once we move on to that secondary or tertiary piece that we're wiring in tandem, we have to maintain that clockwise direction. And once we start in this counterclockwise direction, as we wire out that branch, we have to maintain that counterclockwise direction. That single technique, following the structural, spinning opposite, maintaining the same direction, will always ensure you enter the correct side of the shoulder. Entering the correct side of the shoulder and always following your structural and spinning opposite will make sure that you never change your rotation. And so you see 2 of these 3 checkpoints, and that's why we give you 3, because you guys are going to latch on to different pieces. 2 of these 3 checkpoints will ensure the mechanics of your secondary, tertiary wiring in pairing those branches together is effective functionally and aesthetically in terms of the best technical execution. So let's go in. Let's start to take a look at, number 1, our strategy for pairing similarly sized branches and all of the different ways that we can adapt and adjust our wiring strategy based on what the branch throws our way. Let's take a look at keeping those combinations close or close-ish, and even look at what happens if we get them a little bit too far apart so we understand the dangers. And then let's look at these 3 checkpoints as it applies to our pines, junipers, elongating species, and deciduous, and all of those various models and modes to understand the strategy behind and the mechanics that drive our functional and aesthetically pleasing application of secondary tertiary wiring. Okay, so now that we've got our structures set and we've put the initial movement into our branch, we need to come back to just that strategy of how we understand or identify the branches that are going to be paired together. And we've talked about those 2 considerations in terms of similarly sized branches and branches that are in close proximity to avoid this accumulation of a lot of wire. Now, when I applied this structural wire, we were already talking about branch pairing, because that branch pairing is educating where this structural wire needs to occur, as well as how we're going to place the movement in this structural branch to prepare all of our finer secondary and tertiary pieces to be in the right spot. So coming back to this pairing, we identified that we were going to stop our structural wire at this point right here, have control of the tip with that turn across the bottom, and we were going to transition to these 2 as our similarly sized branches. Obviously, those being farther apart, it's going to accumulate a little bit more wire here than we typically would want, but it's still going to be acceptable for what we execute in terms of the overall wiring of this branch. Now, notice in the movement that we've placed here, to reiterate that location, we've placed a lot, as many of our finer secondary tertiaries, on the outside of the bends that we've created in this branch. Obviously, we can't be perfect when we have a ton of branches, but that really dictated where I put the movement in, and we can see that across every example of structural wiring on this branch that we've done. So now I'm going to come back and I'm going to start my pairing based on that similar size, close proximity, outside of some of these outlying circumstances and situations. And I want to talk about the strategy that we apply to know that we're applying the secondary and tertiary wiring appropriately. Now, we created 3 checkpoints that we can verify that we're effectively and appropriately wiring these secondary tertiary branches. Based on the fact that the structural wire forms the backbone for all of our structural support in the secondary tertiary model, we're not concerned whether the wire approaches a branch from the top or the bottom of the branch in the same way we would with the structural. Instead, if we're wiring this branch to this branch, knowing that they're similar size and that's the appropriate combination to make, I'm basing my decisions in terms of wire application on following the structural wire with half of that wire that I'm using for the tandem combination and spinning opposite of that structural wire and subsequently my secondary piece of wire. So I'm turning clockwise here and I'm rotating counterclockwise here. That reverse roll of that wire, that single strand of wire moving in opposite directions, actually creates tension and tightens the wire so that we gain function in our secondary application, along with this backbone of the structural wire providing support. That's number one checkpoint. So when one follows the structural wire, the other half of the wire spins opposite when we start to pair branches. Now our second checkpoint was to say we always enter the side of the collar away from the position that our body is placed. Now notice that we're sitting in front of this branch. So we're wiring towards us. The tips are facing towards us. The trunk is back here. So when we say we approach that shoulder farthest from us and we look at the shoulder of this branch, we have a 360-degree shoulder or collar that exists on this branch. A lot of times I'll call this back side or this farthest side from where I'm sitting, I'll call that the trunk side of the shoulder. If you're functioning from a perspective of front to back, it would be the back side of the shoulder, but it's the side of the shoulder that's farthest from me. So if we look at this branch, as opposed to inserting our wire on this side, which would be the side of the shoulder closest to us, we need to be inserting the wire on this back side, that shoulder farthest from us and closest to the trunk. Same in this example. We need to be entering this side, not this side. We need to be entering this side, not this side. We need to be entering this side, not this side. In doing so, if we're following the rotation of our structural wire here and we're spinning opposite here, we automatically enter the correct side of the shoulder. This is where the checkpoints start to work themselves out. So number one, half of the wire follows the structural, other half spins opposite. Number two, we always enter the farthest side of the shoulder or the shoulder closest to the trunk of any branch that we insert the wire into. Number three, once I start spinning in this clockwise rotation, I have to maintain a clockwise rotation through the course of this wire until its finality. Okay? What that means is, if for whatever reason I took this wire and I entered the wrong side of the shoulder, notice I'm on the front side of this shoulder, I would have to change my clockwise rotation and start spinning counterclockwise. We cannot do that. That violates one of those checkpoints. We enter the wrong side of the shoulder, we violated that, we're entering the closest side, and we've changed the rotation of our wire. We've now violated two checkpoints. That's not how we wire, and this would be an ineffective way to wire. But if we come in on this side, now we enter the trunk side or the farthest side of the shoulder. We continue rotating in a clockwise direction. That would be the appropriate way to wire. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to carry this wire all the way down where we want it to be wired to, and I'm going to go through those checkpoints on every single combination that we make and the reasoning behind the combinations that we're forming. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to finish that. Now I'm not sure how these tips are going to work out based on how I'm going to be applying the wire. I'm going to give myself the opportunity to wire one of these with this 12 gauge, or I may decide to transition, carry this onto one of these as support, and combine these two. We'll come back to that. Okay, so again, once I start in the counterclockwise direction, I'm going to finish in the counterclockwise direction. Now notice how I'm maintaining contact and supporting. I call this the pinch method. Once we start getting into secondary, tertiary wiring, these branches are far thinner than the structural, and even on the structural, we always maintain with our offhand that contact of the wire to the branch. It's even more imperative that we maintain that contact when we're doing the secondary, tertiary wiring, and using that offhand to support and take that force off of its application to these finer branches. This singular technique allows us to carry a thicker wire onto thinner branches without doing too much damage. In fact, if we're very proficient and we're solid in our offhand utilization, then we will make sure to never damage that branch, okay? When I finish my wire, always finishing across the bottom, perpendicular to the line of the branch. My branch is coming here, perpendicular, and I leave myself a little bit of a pad here, right? This is because when I form the movement in this branch, I always want to have that tip oriented back up, just a slight nice curve, and we'll come back to formation of the tips. We want to have that pad to give us control of the tip, and when we come back to unwire, this is where we would grab, we would reverse roll, and be able to effectively start that unwiring process without damaging the tip of the branch. Third reason we use this pad, if I try to knock this tip off of that, it would take a fairly significant gesture to knock that off. But if we make this a very short tip, if we stop on the top, a lot of times what will happen is this tip will be oriented down, and this branch will start losing strength as a result of that tip being down instead of being oriented up, where it's going to photosynthesize efficiently and it's going to be able to gain more strength and have more development in that branch as a result of that wiring practice and move. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start pairing these branches. I'm going to talk you guys through this, and I'm going to dispel some of the things that we tend to find we hear about wiring that don't necessarily apply to the total functionality of how we maximize the quality of wire in our tree. Okay, so my next combination, when I start to look here, I see that I have two smaller pieces here, and we talked in the beginning, my placement of my structural wire prevents me from being able to utilize these two branches in combination. I do see a combination here that looks quite effective. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to combine those two. Now, most of you are going to be saying, well, aren't you going to be crossing wire? Nowhere in the application of secondary, tertiary wire do we say that we don't cross wire, okay? And a lot of times when we start talking about secondary, tertiary combinations and we say that this structural wire provides the stability for the effective utilization of secondary, tertiary wire, when we're dealing with these smaller branches, this strong point, that immobile anchor based on the sort of flexibility and the flimsiness of the shoulders of these finer branches, that point of immobility on our structure gives this wire the function that we're looking for, okay? Now I'm going to come back to those checkpoints and I'm going to say, if this wire is moving clockwise, okay, then this half of the wire needs to spin counterclockwise. We're entering the far side of the shoulder, we're entering the far side of the shoulder, okay? So we've just hit two of those checkpoints. And if I start moving in a clockwise direction, I finish moving in a clockwise direction. So I'm moving clockwise here, I entered the effective side of the shoulder, the far side of the shoulder, I continue moving clockwise. I've just made sure to check off all three of my checkpoints, and this is what's going to allow us to be able to apply this wire in the most effective, clean, and functional way possible. So remember those aesthetics and function to the application of wire. You'll notice that as I'm wiring, I'm continuing to sort of clean off bottoms, maybe do a little bit more foliage removal in these areas of the tree as I'm wiring, and these are the fine points that we start to address when we actually start that secondary, tertiary wiring process. So we say we clean it to the best of our ability, but we also know that in this application we're going to have some necessity to continue manicuring the branch, okay? Now, when we talk about how far we carry this tip out of the wire, the goal is not to wire this branch all the way to the tip. The goal in wiring this branch is to have control of this tip. So if you'll notice, this tip has a slight upward curve, and if I stop my wire right here, I have total control of that tip and the ability to orient it with that beautiful, nice, slight inclination upwards. I carry my wire out as far as I have to be able to control the tip. That's where I stop it. The less wire we apply to the finest areas and the less that we mess with this sort of formation of this cloud at the tip, the higher the quality product we're going to have, okay? So I'm not going to style this right now, even though when we wire, we typically wire and try to style at the same time. I'm just going to show you my checkpoints, how I enter, how I follow the structural, how I spin opposite, and how I maintain the same direction of rotation as I strategically pair my branches in this process. Okay, so now I have this kind of outlier here, and I've got these two pieces that exist right here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to combine this guy to one of these two. Now we said we can only have, in any one area, we can only have up to 3 wires maximum, and that's going to change the way that my combinations are formed as a result of that desire to reduce the quantity of wire in any one region of the branch. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and again, if I'm trying to figure out my strategy for how this wire enters this, where this goes, I'm always coming to the shoulder of this branch on the back side, that far shoulder. I'm always following my structural wire. Okay, always following my structural wire. and I'm always spinning opposite on this second half. So we can always check ourselves. What side of the shoulder do I enter on? The trunk side or that far side of the shoulder? I follow that structural wire's turn clockwise here, which means I have to go counterclockwise here. These checkpoints, these are flawless in terms of their ability to guide your process. I'm going to end that tip across the bottom where I have control, go ahead and cut that, leaving my pad. Now I'm going to be coming in here. Now, I'm going to be entering this far side right here. I'm going to hold that against that shoulder, and I'm going to be applying this, maintaining that clockwise turn. Maintaining that clockwise turn. And you guys will have to, when you're applying secondary, tertiary wiring, you know, and I said this in the lecture, a lot of times when we start quantifying this, we start looking at it and becoming more confused. But if you can't quantify it, then you can't correct your mistakes, and that's where it's necessary to really digest these concepts that guide appropriate application of secondary, tertiary wiring. And I feel like whenever we try to sidestep this, that's when we start making mistakes and not understanding our mistakes, okay? Now I want to point out another piece of the puzzle here. Nowhere in our lecture did we say we couldn't cross wires. Nobody is going to give you a silver star or a gold star because you didn't cross wires. That's a rule that was created without any sort of acknowledgement of the function of the wire and the necessity to establish structural control and stability in terms of the pairing of these flimsier branches. A lot of times when we avoid this crossing to give that stability, we create a seesaw or a teeter-totter in terms of our branches, and I'll show you that right here, okay? And what that does is that causes further damage to our finer branches. So this piece, if it gives us function, is okay. However, we also should be able to wire without crossing that structural piece of wire. There is always a way to wire without crossing. If it gives us more function and stability in terms of creating a solid anchor, that is when that is an okay technique. So do not abuse this, because if we can avoid crossing, it will be a higher quality of aesthetic product, but sometimes it serves a very important function for providing that stability, okay? The second point I wanted to bring up, notice that this wire is not up against my structural wire, but also notice when I'm combining this, this branch is not against my structural wire, and this branch is not against my structural wire. Nowhere in this process do we say that all of our wires need to be together as they move down the branch. Now, this practice of putting our wire together does give us the appearance of less wire on the branch because we don't have spaces in between our wire, and so aesthetically it does enhance the quality. However, if for the function of combining this to this, I maintain same angle, same spacing, no gaps, there's no way that this is going to be against this and have this pair to this in terms of the combination that I'm making. So notice how I maintain that same distance from this wire to this wire to this. I enter that shoulder, and we've maintained same spacing, same angle, no gaps, and we've effectively combined those two with entering that correct side of the shoulder, following our rotation, and not changing the direction of that rotation. Okay? This is very effective wiring right here. Okay? So now I'm going to show you what happens when I wire these two guys together without crossing. And this is where we start to get into some of this very sort of intricate decision-making process. So if I enter that, again, on that effective side of the shoulder, I'm going to go ahead and carry this out so that I have a firm hold on this branch, and you'll see how soft and how susceptible the shoulder of this branch is. And if I carry this to here and I move into that shoulder, okay, now all of a sudden when I move one, let me go ahead and carry this out so you can see the whole thing move. When I move one, I get the seesaw. I get that teeter-totter right there, okay? This is not at all desirable. Now, inside of this sort of thinking, we've got to work through the whole process. If we tried to carry this branch down to here, we're going to get 3 wires in this location, and we haven't wired this branch yet. It's going to create 4 wires in this location. This is a common problem that we encounter with junipers. Now, we could leave this combination as it exists right here, and just know that when we move these branches, we support that wire on the shoulders, and we make sure that we don't overly manipulate them, and we can get that to hold just fine. This is how I'm going to wire it. The other way to go about that would be to cross the wires, and the reason that I'm not going to do that in this situation is because I have 2 wires here already, and if I can avoid it, just from a craftsmanship perspective, I want to avoid crossing those two wires. It starts to look very unsightly when we approach it from that perspective, but it would, if we crossed those two wires and came onto this, give us a stronger hold. There are times when the branches are less developed and even flimsier, particularly on our native junipers, where we would go ahead and sacrifice that aesthetic for the function of that crossing. Today, in this situation, based on this being a Kishu Shimpaku that has more rigid branching and a more solid shoulder, I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to intelligently support the branches as I apply this finer tertiary wiring so that I make sure as I'm positioning these, I don't compromise the health of the branches, okay? I'm going to go ahead and go across the bottom, go across the bottom. Notice I have a seesaw, and we're going to come back and we're going to handle that responsibly to effectively combine those branches, all right? Now when we get down to the bottom, notice we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We've got an odd combination of branches. I left myself a 12 gauge in case we encountered this situation. When we're wiring our tree, we always wire from the bottom to the top, the inside towards us or inside to out, okay? So in terms of wiring this now, I have a very clear understanding that I can combine these two, I can combine these two, and I can use this structural wire very delicately. Notice how I'm pinching to maintain that contact, and I'm just going to come across the bottom, just one turn. Now I have control of that tip right where I'm at. I cut that so I leave my little pad across the bottom, and I've got that issue reconciled. Now I'll combine these two, and my branch will be effectively wired from a secondary tertiary perspective. Such a puzzle, okay? Again, entering that back side or that far side of the shoulder, back side, trunk side, far side of the shoulder, I am going to cross here to be able to gain that structural support based on the fact that these are much smaller than these two pieces. Okay, when I start turning in that clockwise direction, following that structural wire, I continue turning in that clockwise direction, entering again the correct side of the shoulder, following the structural, maintaining that consistent clockwise rotation, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to carry this, making sure to not crush any branches across the bottom. I now have control of the tip. I cut. I'm going to carry this through across the bottom. I now have control of that tip. I'm going to leave that pad, and I'm going to cut. Okay, I've got one more combination to be made. Again, following that structural here, I'm going to enter that trunk side or that back side of that shoulder, spinning opposite counterclockwise here, clockwise in rotation here. Watch the pinch method with my offhand. Notice that my index is supporting this so I don't get the teeter-totter. Clean off some of those bottom pieces. I'm going to get out to that end. Notice the pinch for support across the bottom. I cut. Now I'm coming back to this initial branch, making sure to pinch, support, pinch, support. Go ahead and clean off those bottoms, pinch and support. I'm going to get out just so that I have control of that tip. Across the bottom, I'm going to go ahead and cut. Now if I said, oh man, I would really like to have this tip move in this direction and I want a little more control, this is where we objectively look at what we're going to try to accomplish. I can carry that one more turn out, still finishing across the bottom. Now I have total control of that tip, this tip. All of my tips are effectively wired. Notice how clean my secondary tertiary wiring is. Structural sets us up for the correct shape. This is an effective utilization following the 3 checkpoints, following the formation of the primary to position my branches on the outside of the curves. I am now set up to have a beautiful branch styled in an effective way for a juniper with my secondary tertiary wiring.